Correct. They're going all the way through and they're going to decide that we've got to.
Happy to start. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good, great. A very warm welcome to Durham Cathedral. My name is Simon Oliver. I'm Professor of Theology at Durham University. I'm one of the residentiary canons here at the Cathedral, and I'm Director of the Durham Cathedral Institute. The Institute was founded in 2022 to provide a public forum for discussion and debate of today's most important political, moral, and spiritual issues. We gather people together in this magnificent church out of the conviction that God is intimately concerned with every aspect of human life. Communities and individuals have come here for centuries to express their longing for peace and justice and meaning and purpose. And the miners' banners on display in the cathedral at the moment bear testimony to that longing. And so we gather together today as American voters go to the polls in what promises to be, whatever the outcome, an historic presidential election. And it's a huge pleasure and privilege for the Institute to be hosting this event today. Before I introduce our speakers this afternoon, just a couple of housekeeping matters. On your way into the cathedral this afternoon, you'll have been given a slip of paper with a QR code on it. If you scan that code with your phone, it will take you to a website called Slido. And on Slido, you can enter questions that you would like to put to our speaker this afternoon. You can also see the questions that other people have asked, and the ones that you like, you can vote on. So the more popular ones will be put to our speaker. If you're having trouble with your data connection, there is a guest Wi-Fi in the cathedral as well. This is an 11th century building, but we're terribly high-tech. A second bit of housekeeping. There are one or two places in the cathedral with dead spots for sound. It's not particularly easy to hear. If you're struggling to hear and you'd like to try moving to another place, please feel free to do so. Please also bear in mind that it's a bit like emergency exits in an aeroplane. The best place to hear might be behind you. So please do move around if you're struggling to hear at any point. Now to introduce our speakers. Our chair today is Dr. Philip Plimming, who will be very familiar to us as the Dean of Durham. Prior to becoming Dean, Philip was warden at Cranmer Hall in Durham University, where he taught New Testament and Christian leadership. Philip studied German and Russian at university and theology at Durham. He's a renowned expert on the New Testament and the theology of St. Paul, and Philip leads every aspect of Durham Cathedral's life and mission. Joining us for today's event is Dr. Fiona Hill. Fiona is an acclaimed foreign affairs specialist, author, and former advisor to 3 US presidents, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. Fiona served on the US National Intelligence Council from 2006 to 2009. She was a member of the US National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. And in 2019, Fiona gave one of the most powerful and much discussed testimonies at the impeachment of President Donald Trump. Born in Bishop Auckland, the daughter of a coal miner, Fiona's many publications include an autobiography, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. She remains a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a non-profit public policy organization based in Washington, D.C., which conducts in-depth research into new ideas for solving the greatest problems faced by society at local, national, and global levels. Since last year, we've been very proud to have Fiona as Chancellor of Durham University. She has become a great friend of this cathedral over the last couple of years. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome our speakers?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much indeed, Simon, for your welcome and introduction. And it's a real pleasure for me to be hosting this Durham Cathedral Institute this afternoon. On this election day in the US, we're delighted to have someone with Dr. Fiona Hill's expertise, knowledge and wisdom to help us think about US politics, but it's also its impact on the wider world, including this region, whatever tonight's result will be. And I'll be shaping the first 40 minutes or so of our discussion, and then we'll be turning over to questions from the floor. So, Fiona, let's get going.
Thank you, Philip.
Fiona, we're sitting here this afternoon in a cathedral surrounded by mining banners from across the county, a reminder of this region's proud contribution to the economy of this country. I guess it also connects with your own story, growing up in Bishop Auckland, the son of Alfred, a miner. Tell us your memories, first of all, of growing up in that context of a mining community.
Well, actually, can everyone hear? Okay.
No.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, we can now.
We kind of. Can you hear?
No, okay.
Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. I think Philip's got a little bit of an assist from above here in terms of volume that obviously is not working for me too well. But I've got lots of microphones on, and we have our colleagues here from PalTV from the university. I hope they can still hear with the microphone, right? Very good. And people can hear at the back, yes? Yep, great, excellent. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's just always a pleasure to be here, and especially here in Durham Cathedral, which is somewhere that is extremely dear to me from being a child. And in terms of the connection to the mines and the mining banners, my father, by the time I was born, was no longer a coal miner. However, my great-grandfather, Thompson Hill, and actually some other grandchildren of Thompson Hill are here. I can see my cousin Kathy sitting here, for example. And anybody who's called Hill in County Durham is probably related to us because one of our uncles, great-uncles, had a lot of children. So if you look around and there's a hill, it's probably one of our cousins. And there was multiple generations of the Hill family worked in the mines around County Durham. Basically going back to the mid to late 19th century. And that identity of coal mining, the identity that's rooted in all of the communities around County Durham, I think somebody in our family must have worked in almost every colliery in different parts of the county, really did make an impression. Everywhere you went, for example, we usually go everywhere on the bus because nobody had a car in my family either. We'd go on the bus and we'd go through various pit villages, and my dad said, well, cousin here, worked here, or uncle this worked here, or your aunt here, was here. And there was always that kind of sense of being deeply rooted. But unfortunately, I mean, by the time that I was born in the mid-1960s, my dad had already lost 5 jobs, because the coal mines kept closing, and he'd moved from one mine to the next, and they kept getting further and further away, so we couldn't walk to the next job. We'd have to take, a bicycle or the bus. He worked in a brickworks. The brickworks closed down because that was tied to the mines. Then he worked in one of the local steelworks. Surprise, surprise, that closed down as well, one of the mini steelworks. And then he ended up working in the other great anchor institution of the Northeast, the National Health Service. And so actually for most of the latter part of his career, after being a coal miner at age 14, he was working in the National Health Service but as a hospital porter. And that was actually, for me also very formative, because so many people who worked in the mines, for many of the people here, their ancestors, some distant, some closer, once the mines closed, there wasn't really something logical else to do because the training wasn't there, which is why when I look around and I see people from the local schools as well as people here at the university, why education is so important. And the miners and the Durham Miners Association really put a lot of emphasis on education. But unfortunately for the people of my father's generation, that just really wasn't available. They were kind of like the last generation, the people who hit their 30s and then their 40s and onwards when the mines closed down. And they basically were then looking for any kind of work that their skills were vaguely transferable to. So in my dad's case, he could push things, you know, because he'd been pushing coal tubs down the pit. And so as a porter, he was basically pushing people a lot lighter, obviously, than a massive coal tub, you know, from basically, you know, one ward to the other, or, you know, kind of basically around the hospital. And that gave me a kind of a real sense of how the region in that kind of period became somewhat disconnected. And there was that feeling of loss of opportunity that really, I think, shaped a lot of my own desires and aspirations to get an education, and then, you know, later on to try to give something back.
You're giving back something now as Chancellor of the University. One of the things you do as Chancellor of Durham University is preside over graduation ceremonies here in the Cathedral. And I've heard you speak at those ceremonies about the power of education to create opportunity. And you share something of your own experience of leaving the Northeast to go to St Andrews to study Russian. Thinking back to your story, what opportunities did education therefore create for you?
Well, it's interesting, Philip, because you also studied Russian, you know, and German in the same, you know, kind of rough period. I mean, it was very much shaped by world events. I mean, very much like now, we were in a situation of great hostility and confrontation with then the Soviet Union over the stationing of nuclear missiles within Europe, the so-called Euro missile crisis of the 1980s. And I decided that instead of just panicking about the prospect of nuclear war and nuclear annihilation, which seemed like a real prospect back in the 1980s, that, you know, perhaps I could learn Russian. But I had no idea how to do it. It wasn't certainly offered at my school, Bishop Barrington, then Comprehensive School in Bishop Auckland. I think you could study Russian at the time at Durham Johnston and some of the other local schools, but not too many schools in County Durham. And the interesting thing, which ties us back to coal mining again, is the Durham Miners Association had a small number of bursaries of grants for the children of miners to basically, they kind of came under the rubric of bettering yourself, of kind of, you know, improving your educational opportunities. And I actually got a small bursary of £100, which actually at the time seemed enormous, it has to be said, to go to study Russian for a summer course at the University of East Anglia. And I remember going on the bus with my dad and my sister, basically to Red Hills, the Pitman's Parliament, which is just you know, down on the other side near the railway bridges. And there's going to be an event here at Durham Cathedral later on about the reopening of Red Hills, the Pitman's Parliament. And going into a little office and a man looking at my father's record for working down the mines, confirming he was indeed a miner, and then handing me £100 in an envelope, and then telling me to basically spend it wisely and come back and tell them, you know, what I'd done with it. And this was also kind of linked into the history of the Durham miners having connections with miners from around the world, because this is around the time of the Durham miners' strike, and some of this money had been donated to the Durham miners from miners' solidarity groups and unions around Europe, including, ironically, from the Soviet Union, from the Donbass region, which the miners of County Durham had links with going back to the 1920s. And of course, the Donbass is the area that is being most fiercely fought over right now between Ukraine and Russia. And that also gave me a sort of a sense in that of kind of responsibility, because that very first money to study Russian, you know, came from the hard-earned dues of Durham miners, because everything was basically funded by this. And education, you know, obviously for them was very important. Most people who went down the mines didn't get an education beyond age 14 or later, you know, 16. There was a lot of focus on miners' reading circles and literacy groups. And if I had the opportunity, as my dad said, to, you know, basically to go to university, then I should take it. But unfortunately, that kind of came around to the idea that I would also have to leave the region. Because in that time, in the 1980s, as the title of the book that Simon referenced, There's Nothing for You Here, my dad was basically saying the opportunities, you know, to do the things that you would like to do through education at that point in the 1980s were not really here, and especially if you go to study Russian. It wasn't an obvious way of getting a job. I mean, obviously, I wasn't on the dean track for the cathedral, as you clearly were from studying Russian, though an unusual path to take as well. But you know, my whole experience has been one in which education has played a really important role. I wouldn't be doing anything that I'm doing today without that expansion of education, those educational opportunities, including through small grants and bursaries, starting off with the Miners Association.
We're absolutely delighted that there are 150 sixth form students here joining us from different sixth form colleges and schools across the Northeast. We're absolutely thrilled to have you with us. Fiona, what would you want them to hear at this point in their educational journey about the value of education, and perhaps what one bit of advice would you give them?
Well, I think starting with a bit of advice is that, you know, things don't all happen at once. So although it might look, you know, from the two of us sitting here that everything was kind of obvious and laid out and, you know, we were on a kind of a very clear path, that's never really the way. And, you know, it's sometimes a kind of long and unusual path ahead. I mean, if I had been sitting in here in the sixth form and somebody would have said to me that I would have been sitting in a very different setting, giving evidence at the impeachment trial of an American president, I would have told them they were off their heads. I mean, I wouldn't have ever imagined, you know, some of the things that I would have ended up doing, because, you know, your life takes unusual twists and turns. But also the very fact that I started off here, and I remember, you know, coming here on school trips and sitting, you know, similar to people here today, listening to things. The very fact that I could do what I have done is basically a testament to education and to basically taking advantage of any opportunity that comes your way. I would just say be very open to any potential opportunity. Talk to your teachers, you know, get to know all of your classmates. Some of my opportunities in life have come from friends at school telling me about things, or you know, my teachers telling me about an opportunity to study abroad. County Durham has had some really wonderful exchanges. I went, for example, to Tübingen in Germany when I was 15 through a Durham County Council exchange. Also to France. I joined a youth choir. My singing was a little bit better than the other thing that I joined, which was a youth orchestra playing the violin. Nobody would want to hear me play the violin.
That's a shame.
Even myself did not enjoy listening to me playing the violin.
Later on we were. No.
Yes, exactly. Please do not ask me. But what it did was open doors, because I made connections with people, even in you know, those kind of ways that, you know, I didn't expect to. So I would just say you can do anything you want to do. And, you know, sometimes something that doesn't look like an obvious opportunity will open a door to something else. It's, you know, kind of like a road with many crossroads, and always ask for help along the way, because I have not done everything on my own at all. Going back to the money that I was given from the Durham Miners Association, to teachers helping me, to other people giving me advice along the way, every little bit of that has made a difference.
And I'd certainly agree. I was here first 26 years ago, and if you told me I was going to be dean, I'd have no idea. So, Fiona, your education, therefore, and your career took you both to the USA, and you also travelled to Russia, both before and after the end of the Cold War. Take us back to that time. What were your first impressions of both Russia and the USA in the 1980s and 1990s? What are your recollections?
Well, it's interesting because beyond the obvious of these being the two superpowers of the time, the nuclear superpowers, and, you know, I was obviously attracted to studying Russian because of the confrontation, and then felt that after I had been in, I had a scholarship to the Soviet Union in 1987, 1988, and I was there for the first major summit in Moscow between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. I'm going to talk about historic time to be there, but I realized I knew nothing about the United States apart from, you know, what I'd seen on the television, which was mostly, you know, kind of westerns and Dynasty, exactly, or Dallas, and all these kind of, you know, sitcoms and things from the 1980s, right. Which give you a very skewed impression. And I knew very little about the way that the US politics worked, how the culture was. I mean, not actually that much, really, to be honest, about US history either. And I thought that if I'd learned so much, or I'd start to learn so much about Russia, then I should, you know, start to do the same about the United States. So I started again, getting back to this theme of opportunity and looking for possibilities to study. I tried to see if there were some scholarships to study in the United States, and found out that there were. Again, got assistance with how to go about applying to that. And, I was kind of expecting to be immediately immersed into this kind of big, politics, particularly in the wake of what I'd seen in Moscow in 87, 88. But what I was struck in both places was how surprisingly similar they were to the Northeast at the time.
Really?
But in very different ways. So when I first went to Moscow, it was the first city I'd ever lived in. And it felt a little bit like a pit village in County Durham. And what I'll say about this, because all the shops were boarded up or basically had nothing in them. Now, here it was because we had no money, so there was no, demand. And in Russia, there was no supply because of central planning. And, you'd basically go into a shop looking for a pair of shoes and there'd be nothing. Or there'd be 10 pairs all in the same size. I looked out once because I needed to buy a pair of boots. I managed to ruin the boots I'd taken with me. And I went into a Hungarian shop that was near the hall of residence I was staying in, and there were 100 pairs of size 10 boots. That's my size. But it was a bit of a problem if you had size 6 or size 7, you wouldn't be able to wear them. I did not buy all 100 pairs, but I thought, wow, amazing, but not great for other people. And I was really struck then by, obviously there was something wrong with the Soviet economy, it was pretty obvious. And I started to see all of these parallels with the Northeast, thinking these big industrial powers that became the superpowers after World War II and during the Cold War, something was off. And I wanted to try to understand what that was. And when I got to the United States, I got a scholarship to Harvard University. Harvard University was obviously amazing. And once I got, however, beyond the walls of Harvard Yard, I was struck by how much the surrounding area of Boston had declined. Yeah. This was a place that was basically working class, blue collar, built up on the back of car manufacturers, brickworks, a bit like, my dad had worked in a brickworks once, meat packing plants. And all of them, those big factories and industrial enterprise were also closing. There was a sweet factory that was kind of closing as well. And the only drivers of change in the Boston area were the big universities like Harvard and MIT and Boston University. I mean, obviously, if all of you go to visit that area now, you'll see somewhere that's been transformed on the basis of those universities spurring innovation, a bit like Durham and other universities are trying to do here. But it was a period of decline there as well in the 1980s. And I was struck by there was something similar happening everywhere else, and we're still living out the consequences of it, including in this election today.
And we'll come back to that in a moment, Fiona. As you know, I studied Russian as well. I went a little bit after you. I travelled in Russia during the 1990s. And I saw the power of the mafia and the economic collapse after the end of communism. This was the era of the oligarchs. How do you think the experience of the 1990s, years of economic and political humiliation for Russia, continue to shape Russian political life today?
Well, I think as you're sort of suggesting with the way that you frame that question, what we see today with Vladimir Putin as a very authoritarian leader in Russia is a direct product of the sentiments of loss in that period. I think if you look around the development of authoritarianism in many countries, Eastern Europe and elsewhere around the world, and we think back to the 1920s and 1930s, in Europe, the period that gave us the rise of totalitarian regimes in Nazi Germany and also in the Soviet Union itself after the Bolshevik Revolution, they're always rooted in economic grievances. Yeah. And then the kind of feeling that people had lost their identity and lost their futures. And they might look for a political ideology or a political party back in the 20s and 30s, or for a strongman leader. And in the case of Russia, the political culture, for anybody who is studying Russian history here, always reverts towards a kind of a pyramid of power, with at the top being previously the Russian Tsar, the Russian monarch, or the head of the Communist Party. And after a period in the 1990s of, as you rightly described it, kind of chaos, with fairly weak leadership at the top from Boris Yeltsin, who was much more kind of inclined to sort of let the politics open up and let the kind of country go where it would or will at the time. You get then a real desire for the end to the chaos, and Vladimir Putin takes advantage of that. He is hired, or let's say he's not really hired, is he? But he's kind of selected by Boris Yeltsin as his successor. I suppose Boris Yeltsin sort of did hire him, but is kind of thinking of him being somebody who would protect Yeltsin and his family from any kind of political backlash, because that's another theme in Russian politics of the previous kind of people who've been kicked out, often don't meet a very happy fate. And also thinking that he'd be a pair of steady hands at the helm of the state. But Putin had come out of the secret services, out of the KGB, and his inclination was to have a very heavy rather than a steady hand at the helm of the state. And I'm not sure that Yeltsin really anticipated that Putin would turn the clock back. But Putin was also enabled by the fact that people were so unhappy with the state of affairs in the 1990s. And when he started to promise that essentially he would make Russia great again, basically there was a kind of rather, yes, exactly. Well, he did, essentially coin that phrase back in the time. There was essentially a lot of willingness to, basically let him have the reins of power at the center, as long as people were left to get on with their own lives. And I would say that they were largely left to get on with their own lives. In fact, many Russians, I would say, were living their best lives in many respects in the 2000s as the Russian economy picked up. But then, of course, things changed rather dramatically when Putin decides to try to some degree, put back the Russian Empire, turn the kind of clock back, not just to the 20th century, but earlier times, and become, somewhat obsessed by gathering back in lost territories like Ukraine. And so now Russian population are being repressed, and they're also being sent to fight in a really horrific war in Ukraine.
Let's go to the USA, where you've spent your career and where you're now a citizen. Before we talk about politics in particular and the election today, can you give us insights into the state of the union, to coin a phrase, in contemporary United States? And in particular, can you say something about social mobility, the lack of which you've argued is at the heart of political turmoil and disaffection?
Yes, I think that's actually a very important thing to bear in mind as we look at what may happen today in the elections. I talked about what just happened in Russia, where people felt aggrieved and wanted to have some stability and kind of an end to chaos. And there's a very similar sentiment in the United States today. So if Donald Trump is actually re-elected, it won't be just because people basically want to support someone like Trump, but because it's also kind of an outgrowth of the continuation of this sense of grievance and of lost opportunity or expectations being dashed, going back to probably the financial crisis and recession of 2008, 2009, seeing then what happened during COVID and the pandemic, and then the attempts under the Biden administration to revitalize and reignite the growth in the US economy by pumping in a lot of assistance in that period during the end of COVID and then in the wake of COVID, which unfortunately fueled inflation. So just like many people here get a little bit of a shock when you go to the supermarket and see where the prices are. In the United States, obviously inflation fueled a lot of increase in the prices in the supermarkets, in the grocery stores. And of course, the awful thing about inflation is once prices go up, they don't come back down again. That might happen with petrol prices in the United States, but it never happens with anything else. And so people's expectations that if inflation has ended means that things are going to get cheaper, that's never going to happen. And although people's wages actually might have increased in the United States, people don't feel better off. And then there's kind of all the kinds of losses of identity that all of us can appreciate here. If we think back, to the kind of history of the coal miners and those people think of the golden ages of the industrial workers in the United States, where people didn't need college degrees to get ahead. You could get a great job in the steel works or in a coal mine or in manufacturing. And now the new technological changes suggest that people need to have at least a bachelor's degree, or certainly, some kind of advanced education, and those jobs aren't there. And look, and I'll also be frank, that there is a real feeling that women in particular have got ahead much more than men. And you're actually seeing in the United States right now the consequences of social mobility that have happened for women, but not for men in the period since the 1980s. And there's a huge gender gap appearing in this election. So if Kamala Harris gets elected, it'll be to a large part because women and young women in America and older women are all basically voting in opposition to not just the misogynistic language that Trump has, but to this kind of idea of turning back to the clock, to a period where their social mobility was constrained because of, societal mores and, the way that the economy was structured. And I have to say, when I think about that in the Russian context, I spent 6 months last year in Germany, in the eastern part of Germany, in Berlin, looking at what had happened in Germany in the 1990s and the transition there. And from my own experiences here, that I do actually think that women have benefited more from the changes since the 1980s than men might have done. So I think about my father, because there was no expectation, certainly on my part, and I mean, Pathy probably nobody expected we'd go down a coal mine, and the coal mines had closed. And women, kind of back in the 60s and 70s, you might get a chance to be a school teacher or a nurse. My mum ended up being a nurse, a midwife. But there was an expectation that, you were not following your father in your father's footsteps. And once education was there as an opportunity, you might have opportunities to do different things. And if you look at college campuses in the United States now, they're predominantly female. The majority of students are women, young women. And, maybe for some of the younger, men here, they might, kind of also start thinking, well, my sister or my friends or, all the women in, my family seem to be getting ahead. Now, that's not the case in the Northeast quite so much, but it certainly is in some of these other settings. So social mobility is perceived now in the US as being somewhat gender skewed, and that's having actually some implications. In East Germany, I interviewed a German professor who's one of the few former East Germans who's a very senior professor at one of the universities, and he said that East German women did better on 2 markets than East German men. One, the actual job market, and the other, the marriage market. Because East German women would show up somewhere else in West Germany and have no problem finding a date or a husband, and East German men would show up and people would be wincing slightly. So there was actually a lot of discrimination because East German men were perceived to have been, the workers and not to be particularly, well educated. And there's a perception that's going on. It's an awkward thing to talk about, but it's actually showing up in all the polling and showing up in a lot of the research in the United States. It's something that's going to have to be tackled. A colleague of mine from Brookings, Richard Reeves, who's also British, has actually set up a whole think tank thinking about boys and men and why social mobility for boys and men in the US since the 1980s has really not taken off. And I think it's something that we can all relate to here as well, particularly in the northeast of England where traditional jobs have disappeared, and it's not really kind of clear about whether the education system is preparing everybody, no matter who you are, for the new economy.
You've given us the narrative of social mobility around gender. You've suggested that's actually pretty surprising.
In the US it is.
In the US, yeah. Counterintuitive.
Exactly.
Can you speak about social mobility now from the sense of race, which you write very powerfully about in your book, and what does it look like there? Has there been a similar evolution, or what does the picture look like?
Well, that's very complicated in the United States because there's been so much demographic change. And obviously, if we're sitting here in the Northeast, it's very different when you go to London, to see how diverse, London is. London, I think, is the most diverse city, not just in Europe, but I think, internationally at this particular point, which is not a hallmark of the rest of the United Kingdom. And in the United States, we tend to think of this in, I think, fairly stereotypical ways. But the United States demographic profile is changing very rapidly. And when I first got to the United States in the 1980s, I read something about the civil rights movement. We'd obviously knew about Martin Luther King and the March on Selma and the busing and all the kind of efforts that people had undertaken to get equal rights for African Americans. But already in the 1980s, the society was changing. You hadn't got the full participation of African Americans in the economy. The legacy of slavery was, still very evident. But you're also getting through immigration even further changes in the US system. And the US is now at a kind of tipping point where the white population, and I use this kind of very loosely because the United States Census really lumps people from all kinds of different backgrounds together under the kind of rubric of white or non-Hispanic white, which would be a bit alienating for a lot of people from Europe or here from Great Britain as well, because there's no distinguishing made between frankly Arabs, for example, or Jewish citizens, or French or Italian, or Irish, for example, all in that kind of category. So sort of a lumping together of different categories. But it's also that white category is now basically headed towards being no longer the majority, and not even perhaps the plurality. By 2050, the United States will be much more diverse across the board than it's ever been before. And you can see basically tensions arising out of that. Because still in relative terms, particularly based back on the African American, the black community, with the legacy of slavery in the United States, they've never caught up with the average white American. But the white American category includes people like Elon Musk, who's about to be a trillionaire. And if you put him in as the average and all the billionaires, you'd skew the picture for white Americans, many of whom are in absolute poverty as well. Now you're getting within that, this sort of perceptions of tension, that some people are getting advantages based on a definition of race in for some people a rather abstract way, and as a result getting this is part of the backlash that you've seen in the United States that's come out during this campaign in terms of access to education and everything else. That actually is a bit of a stretch, in fact, because there is so much of a problem now in social mobility writ large in the United States. The United States is a bit like the United Kingdom now, less mobile socially and geographically than it was back in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Because the grants and bursaries that people like me would have gotten to go to study, for example, have been reduced. There's Pell grants in the United States, which are quite similar to the kind of grants that you get for being underprivileged here in the United Kingdom. There was the GI Bill, which was put into place after World War II for people who'd served in the military to give them education. But now, for everybody in the United States, just like here, people have to take out loans for their education. And also, since the economic collapse and financial crisis, people and the collapse of the housing market, people just cannot afford to move in search of work. So you're actually seeing people being less geographically mobile, because the whole thing that you saw previously was people would move around, and less socially and economically mobile. And it's not just defined by race, but that's creating senses of tensions and perception that based on these demographic changes, that some groups are doing really better than others. And in fact, you'll find in this election that Trump is getting basically more votes than people would have anticipated from disaffected people who feel that their economic opportunities have been stifled by all of these changes, from groups that people wouldn't expect. It's not all white supremacists or racists who are voting for Trump, but people who feel otherwise disaffected, from Hispanic groups, from African Americans, and others who don't really feel that they should be categorized in this way. So it's actually a very complicated situation in the US now.
Let's turn therefore to politics, and can I put to you a question from one of our students from Sunderland College who's here today, who asks, what are the root causes of the increasing partisanship, i.e. polarization in American politics, and how might they be addressed? In other words, we're seeing this has been described as the most polarized US presidential election ever. What are the root causes of that?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question, because we see a lot of polarization or fragmentation in many other countries, but it doesn't always take this same partisan form. Because you can see here in the UK, in Germany, in France, many other countries, that there's been a lot of disaffection with mainstream parties. So even though the Labour Party looked like it got a landslide in the most recent election, when you look at that, that's actually not really the case at all. That's what it looks like because we've got a first-past-the-post system, but you actually see a lot more variation and a lot more nuance, let's say, and complexity behind that seeming landslide for the Labour Party. Now, in the United States, efforts to create third parties have always failed because the two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, tend to be these big umbrella parties that actually have all kinds of different factionalism within them. And so, you have, traditionally for the Democrats, a kind of left, which is not very far left from a European sense, to a kind of centre that almost might be seen as a kind of centre-right, exactly. And then traditionally the Republicans have been sort of centre-right and then not that far right, but with the advent of Donald Trump, they've gone way to the right, to the kind of a populist right, that actually almost kind of comes back to a kind of a radical left in a kind of a European context, as well. They kind of call it the horseshoe effect, where left and right kind of meet together in a kind of populist context here. And that's also a sign of disaffection with these political parties. But the other thing about the United States, and there's a great course that one of the professors here at Durham has been teaching on the 2024 election. I don't know if he's put this online, David Anderson. So, I mean, if he's got it online, people should, basically check this out, which talks through the vagaries and complexities of the American political system, is that the president almost stands above these political parties. There isn't an actual leadership of the political parties. There's not kind of card-carrying members of the Democratic and Republican Party. Any person within the US can just sort of register when they register to vote as either a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. I obviously registered as an independent, which is actually really kind of one of the larger groups. It's kind of a third. And anybody can run as the putative presidential candidate of one of those parties. In fact, Donald Trump was once a Democrat. And, you have Bernie Sanders, who ran in 2016, who is a self-described socialist and is an independent, but, also ran as one of the Democratic candidates. And for a period in 2016, there was so much disaffection with both parties that really the nomination and then the election of Donald Trump could be seen as something of a protest vote. Trump himself said it was kind of like Brexit here in the UK, which was where people were aggrieved about the larger state of affairs, and when they were given an opportunity to vote for or against, basically staying in the EU, that became an outlet for protests, and Trump basically picked up that protest vote, not across the board, of course, because he only won by a narrow margin in the electoral college, which is another part of the complexity of the US system, very much a vagary. So the 2016 election was decided by just a couple of 100,000 people in a few states in the United States, and that could happen again, frankly, today. But over the time, since Trump was kind of elected as a bit of a shock candidate, that partisan divisions has re-emerged again. The Republican Party's been taken hostage by the Make America Great Again faction around Trump. The kind of conventional Republicans have basically been kicked out, ejected of the party with nowhere else to go because there isn't a third party proposition. You see many of them now actually campaigning for Kamala Harris because they don't know where else, to kind of like basically go. They can't really set up a third party. They're kind of hoping that voters will kick out Donald Trump so they can try to regain the Republican Party again. And the Democrats have themselves been all kind of caught up in kind of fights and arguments and political disputes about whether they should tack to the left or to the right or to the center. And Kamala Harris has been playing a very cautious and careful role through this campaign, trying to kind of find where the electorate and where the Democratic Party should be going. So if this were a parliamentary system, it would be actually, kind of very difficult to judge the outcome. It would be probably like a coalition kind of government, like the kind we saw in Germany or that we've seen in other places. But because it's a presidential system, and it's a bit like the first past the post with the electoral college, a winner takes all, you could end up with a kind of an extreme outcome that does not reflect at all where the politics are in the United States. Frankly, the politics in the United States are not that different from politics here, in Germany, in France. They're kind of all over the place. And most people are not really sure, where they think the country's heading. They're not that very pleased about it, but there's still that very strong partisan identification. Lots of people will vote for Trump because he's the nominated leader of the Republican Party. That partisan identification has become more extreme over the last couple of years, in part because of the influence that Donald Trump has had in sort of capturing the Republican Party, and then in response to a lot of the things that he's actually done.
You said, therefore, that the role of the US president, in some sense, is almost above the party politics, but that's now changed because of the present dynamic we're living through. You've served in 3 presidential administrations. You've also done a brilliant psychological portrait of Vladimir Putin, and I wonder, could you do the same for the 2 candidates who are being elected today, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris? What would be your, I realise only thumbnail, psychological portrait of both of them?
Well, it's easy for Trump. I think all of us could do that. I think we've all seen him, in action, and this is, basically a man who thinks only about himself. And everything that he's doing is really about, kind of his own interests. Okay. I mean, he wants to be president because he thinks he's the most amazing person on the planet. I mean, he talks about this all the time. So I think, again, and he also is very worried about criminal cases against him and, kind of what might actually happen if he isn't in the presidency and can't pardon himself for all of his many transgressions. It's actually harder to do that kind of sketch, I would say, for Kamala Harris. I think, nobody, even perhaps Kamala Harris herself, is having a hard time figuring out how she'd be basically presenting herself moving forward because of this complexity of the political system. And she herself obviously has a very unusual and interesting background. Getting back to this, demographic change in the United States, she epitomizes it. Her mother is South Asian from India, from the Indian subcontinent. Her father is from Jamaica. Both of her parents are immigrants who came for education, for educational opportunity to the United States. She went to Howard University Historical Black College, which was at the forefront of the civil rights movement back in the 1960s. She's exactly my age, so she's kind of a product of that, kind of period of change. She joined a black sorority, so she was very active in kind of campus politics, obviously very focused on women's issues. Again, another example of women getting ahead in that particular period. She studies law, and again, very different from Trump, couldn't be more different, and then becomes a prosecutor in California, a state that is essentially the size and has the capacity of a country. It would be something like the 6th or 7th largest economy, in the world if California were an independent state, and a very specific politics. It doesn't, and economic and, kind of industrial and other innovation profile that doesn't fit with the rest of the country at all. And so, she's kind of being pigeonholed as kind of part of a sort of West Coast elite, but, again, her background is very complex. A bit like Barack Obama, who wasn't also kind of a conventional American candidate. She doesn't come out of this legacy of slavery, of African Americans with those kind of divides that you've seen in the United States. And, it's kind of hard to really pigeonhole her. And as vice president, she wasn't really given an opportunity to express herself, because the vice president is kind of a sort of an assistant to the president and doesn't really have they're kind of given the various ceremonial things to do that nobody else really wants to do. And so she doesn't really have kind of a brief or a portfolio, and she's trying to find her way, through all of this. And she wasn't really given a lot of time to prepare, given the situation with Biden pulling out almost at the 12th hour. So it's very hard to say, where she would head. But I would just, say that on the surface of everything, she's a lot more decent human being than the alternative. So let's just say where that heads.
You wrote in the book. You said it became clear to you that Donald Trump could not differentiate between what was good for his family and what was good for the United States of America. Can we turn, therefore, in my final question before we turn it open to the floor, to the question of kind of foreign policy. I mean, one of the reasons why we're discussing the US presidential elections here in Durham is because the USA has a huge impact on the wider world, and so the role of the US president is key. In your time working in foreign affairs, you've seen the rise of China as a major global power to compete with the USA. You've also written and spoken on the impact of Ukraine and USA's support of Ukraine and the way that's so crucial. And obviously we're all aware of the USA's support of Israel in the present Middle Eastern conflict, really. I wonder if you could comment on how you see the choices before America in terms of its impact on the world stage, perhaps with those three areas in mind, but as you see it.
Yeah, the world is, as you've just depicted here, an extraordinarily complex place. As you were framing the question there, I was kind of looking, down the nave here and thinking that there's the plaque to the Washington family just through the door there, on the left-hand side. And George Washington, obviously from Washington, County Durham, namesake of Washington, DC rather than CD, and famously the first president of the United States, deep roots here. He very famously gave a farewell address when he decided to give up the presidency, which was remarkable in itself. He could easily have actually decided to stay on as president, and he wanted to make that distinction between the tyranny of the monarchy that the United States had thrown off through the Revolutionary Wars, and the idea of kind of a republic with an elected president who would give up, as a kind of a matter of course, the reins of power when they were kind of elected out or came to the end of their term. But his farewell address was also warning the United States about foreign entanglements. He was very worried about the young American Republic, getting tied up in the whole kind of intrigues of kind of, monarchical Europe, as, back in the 18th century, secret diplomacy and treaties and all kinds of other, as he put it, entanglements that could lead the United States astray and, away from kind of principles and distract it. Well, I would think that very sadly, George Washington's warning is very prescient now, because the United States finds itself, as a result of all kinds of very bad choices made, I would say, over the course of this century in particular, but things that have been, set in motion long before, in a very difficult place, which has actually brought the rest of us into a difficult place as well. I mean, I think, by this, if we think about the promise when you and I were, studying Russian, notwithstanding what we've just said about what things were like in Russia in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, we all thought that we had an opportunity to put international relations on a completely different footing.
Yeah.
But then, in the beginning of the 2000s, we had the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And the United States made a decision that was somewhat understandable, but actually, if you'd looked at British history, probably not at all a good idea, of intervening in Afghanistan and the pursuit of Osama bin Laden. If any of us, I remember reading a lot of history of Afghanistan when I was in school, and I'd always been struck by the retreat from Kabul, and only when one man on a donkey made it out of the 14,000 British service people and families who had been there at the time. It was never going to turn out well. That was certainly, kind of the impression that one would get from just a cursory reading of history. But then far worse than that is the decision by the United States, dragging the UK into that as well, to basically intervene and invade, frankly, Iraq in 2003. And I think that everywhere that we get to now really goes back to that ultimate foreign entanglement, which was based on faulty intelligence, basically kind of in my view, a very wrong-headed assessment of what was going on in the Middle East and Iraq at the time. And it was really kind of then that decision that led to the rise of ISIS and other extremist groups in the Middle East, obviously the collapse of the Iraqi state, The Russians looked at this and thought that the United States was just deciding to willy-nilly intervene here or there. They understood Afghanistan. They'd been there and done that as well, not in a particularly a great way for them either. I mean, the Soviet Union also went into Afghanistan, had to pull out after 10 years of a debacle there, kind of as well. But they didn't understand Iraq at all. Putin and others around him knew that Iraq did not have any weapons of mass destruction. And they then believed that the United States had made this decision just in basically the interests of toppling a government that they didn't like, and then basically trying to impose their views upon it. And that then, there's a direct, I'm afraid, link from that for Putin thinking, well, if the United States can literally get away with doing whatever it wants on the international stage, rupturing the UN Charter, etc., why should they have that and not the rest of us? There's a line, unfortunately. And everything has been kind of accumulative. There's all kinds of mistakes have been made in international affairs, but it's that entanglement and, kind of bringing, others along to it that really kind of changed the dynamic. I also think that if we look back over, this kind of period at the end of the Cold War, that there still was a rather unhealthy dependence on the part of the UK and Western Europe on US defence. Instead of really kind of thinking about how Europe itself would like to engage in thinking about longer term security, and now we're really going to have to think about this as you look at what is happening in the United States. There was still a kind of a feeling, well, the United States would be the decisive element. We wouldn't really have to do anything. Intervention in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, for example, in the Balkans during the Balkan Wars, following along in kind of Iraq and Afghanistan, just expecting the United States to always hopefully do the right thing, but not then standing up to kind of think about what Europe itself wanted to do. And that's been also kind of the lesson from the period since 2016 with Trump in power, that Europe and Europeans, in fact it goes back to 10 years ago to the summit in Wales for NATO under Barack Obama after the Russians had annexed the Crimean Peninsula, where it should have been obvious then and been kind of made obvious that Europeans would have to do more to think about security and defence, and how Europe, the UK included, would be kind of thinking about the future of the region. So those kind of hard decisions were already on the table some time ago. The United States got itself entangled in all kinds of conflicts that have led us to where we are today in Ukraine, also to the Middle East, frankly. The conflicts with in the Middle East, in Israel, and also with Iran involved. And when I talk about the complexity of the moment, when the major country in an international system kind of loses its way, as the United States clearly has, that's when the system starts to come apart. We see not just people feeling disaffected with the domestic system, but also with the international system. And there's a great eagerness for the Russians and the Chinese to see the United States out the door, close the door behind them, and kind of have them gone. But this also kind of means that there is no center of gravity for kind of figuring out how to resolve all of the conflicts that we see that have unfolded from everywhere to Yemen and Sudan, Ethiopia, all the kind of conflicts that are not in the headlines in the way that what's happening in Gaza and Ukraine tend to be. And also we're seeing many of those conflicts bringing in other powers, like we saw in World War I and World War II. In fact, the war in Ukraine has become a proxy war for adversaries of the United States. China is involved in supporting Russia. We're hearing about North Korean troops now kind of amassing, ready to join in the fray, about 8,000 North Korean troops, for example. And Iran is also supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine, as well as Iran, being on the verge of, kind of a conflict with Israel, or Israel being on the verge of a conflict with Iran, depending on your, perspective on this. So everything has really come together. Everything has become entangled in ways that, getting back to George Washington, he feared all that kind of time ago.
He was very prescient.
He was prescient, yeah.
Let's turn to some of the questions that are coming up on the Slido app, and do get your Slido up on the phone and use the scan code, or you can just type in Slido and give the number there if you want to sort of be voting up some questions. Can I pick one? Somebody asked a question about NATO, and I think that picks up on what you were talking about, the Europeans needing to invest in their own defence. The question is if Trump wins, but we might put it if Trump or Harris wins, what will the US's relationship with NATO look like?
Well, Kamala Harris seems more interested in alliances and partnerships, certainly, than Trump does. Trump is not really particularly interested in basically working with others. I mean, again, it's an offshoot of his personality, and he's already made it very clear that he thinks NATO is basically ripping off the United States. That not only is this just an unhealthy dependency of European allies, but it's also kind of draining, kind of funds away from the United States. That's his perspective. But I think no matter who is going to win today, we should expect less of the United States in the European context. That's also been made very clear. It's been made clear again going back to the Obama period. 10 years ago at the World Summit, President Obama also basically said that Europeans are going to have to pay much more attention to European security. And so, there will be most likely NATO with less of the United States involvement in the European aspects of this, no matter what happens. It's just, will it be more abrupt in terms of the change and a bit more dramatic, or will it be more of a kind of a gradual change from the US side? All of that is made, I think, extraordinarily clear. So this is the moment was actually 10 years ago, but this is absolutely very much the moment for the United Kingdom and other NATO allies to start to think about what are the priorities. I mean, obviously defense begins at home, what this is about defense and about, kind of in a mindset about, what is important for the UK, but it's also in that broader NATO context, because the UK could not defend itself without being part of the NATO alliance. When you look at, some of the threats that come from Russia, from China as well, frankly, it doesn't matter that we're not close to China, but cyber attacks, threats to trade routes, fiber optic cables, pipelines, all of those can come from really any quarter. Sadly, I hate to say it, we're more vulnerable now than we were actually in the 1980s. We worried a lot then about nuclear weapons, but we weren't kind of thinking about our pipelines or our cables or satellites. We certainly weren't thinking about space, in the way that now, your GPS, thinking about everything that you use your phone for, or, basically just the whole dependencies that we have, here in the United Kingdom on, supplies from around the world. All those could be ruptured very easily and, put us in, kind of a really very difficult position.
Somebody's asking about the risk of violence. There's a couple of questions about violence. Do you think there is a risk of violence as we saw in the last election? And what does this tell us about the way in which elections are being fought?
Well, look, I think in the United States, very sadly, there's a risk of violence all the time. Mass shootings that have become a horrible fact of life in the United States. Last year, when I spent these months in Germany, my daughter came to study and to be with me, and my husband came as well. And she went to a school in Berlin, and we were walking to the school. And one day she said to me, Mom, this is the first time I haven't thought about being shot when I go to school. And that gave me a kind of a real horror. I also thought about all the time when I go to work, we have, training and, for mass shooting events. That is absurd in any kind of context. But there's so many guns per capita. I don't think George Washington was thinking about this, when, they were thinking about the Constitution and, all the kind of amendments for a militia. They were thinking about, how to protect America against the return of the UK, of us again, kind of coming back to get them. They weren't kind of thinking about how this would play out over time, where people believing that they have a, right to have, weapon, and, as a result of that, anyone with a problem and a grievance and, something that they feel very unhappy about, or people with, troubles, writ large, kind of want to go out there and take pot shots at people, from schools to cultural events, sports events, rallies, as in the case of Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. And you think also about all of the assassinations of American leaders, President Lincoln, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. This is a country where there has been a propensity for political violence. And so, unfortunately, one has to kind of anticipate this. We had January 6th and the kind of events that we saw during the period, I mean, it obviously wasn't actually contested. Biden had won, but Putin, kind of might be, kind of one of the people who's kind of hoping that all of this kind of like plays out. But plenty of Americans are also hoping that this will kind of play out. Trump contested it and continues to, suggest that the election will be stolen. We've got disinformation, everywhere. Again, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, North Koreans, everybody is piling on here. I think with the hope that there will be political violence. So, I mean, this is really now incumbent upon Americans to try to rein that in. It's more likely than not that there will be political violence. So that's kind of actually, a call to the reverse of call to arms, but a call to action, for people to try to address this, to stop it.
There's a question around here around Roe versus Wade. Obviously, that's been a huge impact of the last 4 years of the presidency, although, of course, the seed for that was sown by the appointments that Donald Trump made when he was president in terms of the appointments to the Supreme Court. The question is, does Roe versus Wade being overturned really have a significant impact, given the fact that states can pass the laws that abortion can be legal within the state under the Constitution? In other words, does Roe versus Wade, we are aware that Kamala Harris is speaking massively about that and has been speaking about her campaign. Is it really the issue, is the question that we're being asked from the floor?
It actually has become, sorry, that was a bit loud, wasn't it? Yes, it actually has become a very significant issue, but not perhaps quite in the way that people would have anticipated, because there's actually still a push to have a national ban on abortion. So not just left to the states. And this was kind of some of the sort of dissembling, let's say, around the whole repeal of the legislation. The idea was, exactly that should be put to the states, so the people of the states can then decide for themselves. But there is actually still a kind of a push for a national ban. Now, irrespective of what you think about an abortion, the right to life, etc., the impact of this has actually been devastating on women's health. And you saw Michelle Obama, for example, talking about this. There are literal areas of the United States now which were already underserved from the medical point of view, where doctors, gynecologists, midwives will not actually practice now for the fear that in the event of an emergency during pregnancy, that they will be prosecuted for actually trying to intervene. And there's lots of stories now emerging for as soon as the bans went into effect in some of the states, where women lives have been put at risk, on women have actually in fact died because their pregnancy needed to be terminated for the sake of their health. And that's kind of something that is playing out. There's also been efforts to prosecute women who might have had miscarriages or stillbirths. And this is now kind of taking on all kinds of different dimensions, which frankly were quite predictable because of the kind of the politicization of this. In the United States, abortion laws had been passed. Roe versus Wade had been on the basis of women's privacy, not on the basis of women's health, which tends to be the kind of the perspective here in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. Where, I mean, if you look around Europe, abortion laws are quite restrictive, but they're not, it's not precluded on the basis of health and of healthcare. And so we're now actually starting to see women's health, writ large, basically put at risk. The United States also has appalling statistics on maternal mortality,
yes,
and also infant mortality. And all of this, kind of really is being affected as well. So this is actually a very complicated issue. And what you're starting to see coming out as a course of the election is a movement to address this health aspect and coming to this kind of gender divide again as well, that women and their bodies are being put, and their health are being put at risk as a result of this politicization of this issue.
One of the popular questions is asking you to say a little bit more about Trump. You write brilliantly about it in your book, one of which I've quoted really, but this question invites you to think about what the positives might be. And the question is this: what was working with President Trump like, and do you think there were ways in which he was a good president?
No. I'm
Next
sorry.
question.
I mean, it's very hard to normalize this, honestly.
Okay.
And the people who are looking for this, the silver linings, are trying to normalize a very abnormal situation. My judgments on Trump are not based on ideology and partisanship. I thought long and hard about what colours I would wear today. It's like this, wearing black, which I hope is not kind of a metaphor for where the thing's going. Because I always tend to wear blue or red, and I thought, God, if I wear the blue, people think I'm trying to say one thing. If I wear the red, I'm kind of another, because it's, kind of flipped from here. The Conservative blue is the Democratic blue, and the, kind of the red is Labour, but it's also Trump's, kind of favourite colour of his tie. I mean, this is a man who is a raging narcissist, and anything that he has done in terms of kind of policies, he often did ask very good questions. It's all still about him, and he wants credit for everything. He has terrible impulses he's a very impulsive, kind of capricious person. He singles people out for, basically criticism. He's threatening, basically to lock up people like me and many others who've criticized him. I mean, there are people who are acting in Trump's name who've got lists. I'm on a list of 600 people that a guy actually worked with in the administration, a former US military officer. Has maintained, where he wants people to be swatted. This is where people call out the US police trained with their guns and say that some violent act is happening at your house in the hope that the police will come in and shoot you or shoot your dog as it runs towards the doors and then burst through, kind of without knocking. Or that people will hunt you down, kind of, and putting up, what's called doxing, putting up all of your personal information, which frankly anyone can find on the internet anyway, but in the hope that somebody will take matters into their own hands and do something nasty to you. Trump allows all of this, basically to happen. He gaslights people. When people accuse him of doing something, he says, no, you're doing it. There's all of this kind of back and forth about, Trump doing things, and people are saying, well, and he's saying, no, Kamala Harris is doing this, or the opponents are doing this. This is a man who is not rooted in the US political system. He's not a Republican. He's running, basically, he's not a conservative. He certainly doesn't believe in the kinds of values and, ethical, see, I'm sighing here. I kind of feel like, it's really very, hard to keep on, pointing this out, that it's, if we normalize him, if we give him the kind of like the benefit of being a normal president, then we're normalizing some pretty appalling behavior and very likely outcomes. And the reason you didn't see so much of this the first time around is because there was an awful lot of people who were in the administration, trying to kind of implement what, kind of they thought would be reasonable policies on the basis of the things that he was questioning and, kind of raising ideas about, or actually trying to curb his worst instincts, like shooting people in the knees, or kind of basically deporting millions of people, which actually still could happen here. There's going to be some very hard choices that are going to have to be made here in the United Kingdom and elsewhere if Trump is in power, about what you do when people like me are arrested, or General Milley, the former chief of staff, or when people are being persecuted on the kind of the basis of their politics or things that they've said about Trump.
So you indicate in that answer there, Fiona, that you think some of the checks and balances that were exercised in the first presidency, in his first term, would not be there in a second term?
It'll be a really severe stress test. A lot of the checks and balances won't be there because there's been, kind of a lot of changes at the Supreme Court. I think a lot of the checks and balances would come from the states themselves. But we again, this has been uncharted territory, so I'd rather not take the risk. But we'll have to see whether, we mentioned California before, whether the state of California or the state where I live, Maryland, where, there is a lot of opportunity for the states, to kind of chart their own course, whether they would push back against, kind of various efforts to, impose Trump's will from the center. He's talking about essentially defunding and dismantling the federal government. So it'd be the loss of things like the Small Business Administration. He's talking about dismantling the National Oceanographic and, basically the Meteorological Society, or privatizing it. So you'd have to pay for your weather forecast. And you wouldn't be getting the kind of warnings that, we had ahead of these terrible hurricanes that recently went through Florida and North Carolina. For example, people would only get it if they paid for it, for example. Or getting rid of the Food and Drug Administration, or the Department of Agriculture, or the Department of Energy. He talks about basically the Department of Education, stripping down the federal government and putting more emphasis on the military and the National Guard, which would mean that all of that would revert to the state. So there's kind of then less likelihood that all the constituent parts of the United States will be working together. You could be seeing the kind of so-called red states pitted against the blue states. He said that he's only the president of the people who voted for him. He would give special privileges to those states that would have a Republican, majority. So would the other states, where in fact, the weight of the economy is actually really located, be a check against that? Would state legislatures, state, yes, exactly, like California or Maryland or others, Massachusetts, would their court system, their legal system be a check and a balance against what Trump wants to do? Because he's captured the Republican Party. There wouldn't be that kind of check within the system. The media has also been gutted. The media is another, kind of way in which ordinary people have a means of, checking, finding out through investigative journalism, things that are happening. And the most disturbing thing for me in the elections, and this goes back to a piece of legislation that was passed by the Supreme Court about 10 plus years ago, Citizens United, which allowed money to have the equivalency of free speech in the American system. I mean, it is shocking that Kamala Harris has had $1 billion in donations. I mean, when you really think about it, $1 billion, really, to run a campaign. We've got people like Elon Musk, a trillionaire practically, who's running around giving people $1 million prizes to vote for Trump, and kind of basically paying people to vote. That basically impact of money within this election would then be even further unleashed. That basically big business people, oligarchs who have funded the election, would also be given positions in a Trump government as kind of quid pro quos for supporting him. That puts the United States in a very different position, more on the kind of path that we saw Russia move into in the 1990s and 2000s, the periods when we were watching that. That worries me a great deal as well. Now, if something, kind of like all of this, the worst case scenarios didn't, come about, it would be because of the system still trying to kind of revert itself to the checks and balances. But I would worry much more from what I've seen that most people would want to indulge Trump because he's a bully. And, kind of, he's had that kind of propensity to bully the people around him, and he's not, really particularly listening. So I worry very much that those checks and balances that we saw in the system the last time would not be there.
You mentioned that the UK and other European nations would have some hard choices. What would be those hard choices?
Well, look, I think the tendency would be, well, let's just manage Trump. We saw the first time around that, the leaders of countries decided to pander to him. There's lots of examples. The former Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Abe, for example, going off and playing golf with Trump on a regular basis, creating a special sumo wrestling competition with a Trump trophy. Remember, the King of Saudi Arabia created a Golden Globe Fest and had this, spent millions, literally millions of dollars on courting Trump and bringing him on a trip to Saudi Arabia. I mean, I was in the administration when there was the whole dilemma of what to do about Trump wanting his special relationship consummated, so to speak, with the United Kingdom, where he wanted to ride around with the Queen in the golden carriage and stay at Buckingham Palace, and that didn't, quite pan out. And so there was just an awful lot of pandering to Trump. And that will be the tendency. It's like, oh my God, we've got to manage him by pandering to him and just, kind of hoping that, we don't get on his wrong side. Maybe we have to buy more, kind of US armaments or, kind of give the United States preferential, kind of position in our economy. Because he will be bullying, he will be leveraging. One of the things that he's made very clear is he wants to put tariffs on goods coming into the United States. The United Kingdom and other European countries will absolutely not be basically given a pass on this. He's talking about 10 to 20% tariffs on imported goods. The United Kingdom exports a lot of goods to the United States. It's one of the biggest investors in the United States. He wants everybody to come and invest in the United States and build things and produce things in the US and also open up, the kind of markets for US goods. That is not necessarily a two-way, mutually beneficial street from Trump's perspective. And then it also will be, the excesses. He has an enemies list. There's a lot of people in the UK on his enemies list. I mean, that might be, kind of less consequential when he's bad-mouthing, people here, but he will be, kind of encouraging, I think very difficult political interactions. If you think of Elon Musk egging on some of the right-wing violence after Stockport and the terrible upsurge of violence that we saw here in the Northeast and elsewhere, there'll be more of this. Because during the time when I was in the Trump administration, Trump was always tweeting out things like Britain first, kind of basically the, very extreme, kind of right-wing, semi-fascist, basically videos encouraging, that kind of sort of sense of a world divided against itself, because that was beneficial for him as somebody who's a divisive player within the US system. And he'd be encouraging that kind of activity and behavior, populists of the world unite in other countries as well, potentially to the detriment of our own, kind of basically social stability and cohesion in places like the UK and elsewhere in Europe.
Do you feel that personally? I mean, you mentioned that there's a list. Is people in your category, the people who've sort of spoken out in the past, is that something you feel personally exposed?
Well, it's certainly a kind of a weird experience being on, kind of a sort of hit list, kind of 600 people. I think it's probably larger than that by now. I'm also on the, the kind of, list of Vladimir Putin of people. There's thousands on that list of people who are no longer, kind of welcome in Russia as well. So, I'm getting it from all kinds of, sides as well. It's just as well that Durham Cathedral has sanctuary, exactly, sanctuary, clinging to the knocker, kind of later on for the 900 years. Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's good to be here in this place of sanctuary. Obviously, and there's also people feel it. I'm not, by any means getting too, het up, as we'd say in the Northeast, about it, because you have to, basically just take that on board and decide how you're going to deal with it. But I'm not taking it lightly, let's put it that way. And I don't think anybody should in, kind of watching how this might play out over time. That's why I don't want to indulge in normalizing Trump, because he's not normal. This is not how, kind of certainly George Washington would have thought that the United States would have turned out. This is, in fact, the appearance of the very tyranny that Washington warned about when he was basically leaving the position of president. We're facing it right now, hundreds of years later.
I want to come back to a question I wanted to ask earlier, which was like the big picture and stepping back really and seeing this global tectonic plates changing in terms of power. We talked about the rise of China that you've witnessed in your time. I was in Ephesus a few weeks ago, and there you see all the majesty and beauty of the Roman Empire, which flourished for hundreds of years, but ultimately fell apart. And you've painted a very, very sobering picture of what a Trump presidency could look like, but you've also described the fact that under a Harris presidency, there are still huge challenges around social mobility, and the stats are going the wrong way in many places. Therefore, on this election day, setting aside the next 4 years, if you like, is there a case to be made the USA is actually facing inevitable decline and that China is going to dominate for the next 100 years? Or is the outcome more uncertain than that? And is it more up for grabs?
It can be both at the same time. In 1988, when I was thinking about also finishing up one university course in Russian and modern history and thinking about what I might do next, there was a very famous history book that was published, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, by Paul Kennedy, who actually grew up not too far away from here in Wall's End. And Professor Kennedy is now a professor at Yale, was basically charting exactly what we're talking about, the rise and fall of the European great powers. And of course, sitting here in Durham, not too far away from the Roman wall, and thinking about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, we were the periphery, but we were part of the Roman Empire here. That is also kind of a rather extraordinary thought as well. And Bishop Auckland had still does have the remains of a major fort, Venovium plus Binchester, which was the last big fort before the Roman wall, and with the Roman road passing, close by here through Chesterley Street and on the way to Hadrian's Wall. It's hard not to think about this. And there is certainly a kind of, Trump seems like a a mixture of, kind of Caligula on the one hand and Nero, both of them, which is kind of a little dramatic. The love child of Caligula and Nero, fiddling while Rome burns. I mean, you can, pick your Roman Empire. There's also Caesar, kind of crossing the Rubicon, and Rome gives us everything, kind of that we might want to think about cautionary tales, but also the prospect of renewal. I mean, once the Roman Empire left, there were many other societies that basically grew up on the back of that. The Holy Roman Empire came along. Here in Britain, reconstitutes itself. We have the Venerable Bede, we have St. Cuthbert, we have a period that was supposedly the Dark Ages, but a period of enlightenment and of the kind of very origins of ecclesiastical thought and kind of later, critical thinking that kind of emerged out of all of this. It's definitely a time where we have to think about renewal and doing things differently. The institutions that we've had since the end of World War II need refurbishing. The United Nations this past year has been thinking about a different future, but the sustainable future, a different future. How do you revitalize the international system? And here in the United Kingdom, with a new government in after 14 years, there's all kinds of reviews going on: defense review, development review, foreign policy review, social review, homeland security review. Everything you can think of is being reviewed, the economy. Everybody knows that we need to do something differently. And I don't think that if Kamala Harris is elected today that she's going to be complacent, because, as I said before, it'll be, something of a miracle if she is kind of elected. It's very hard to tell what's going to happen in the polls. They're just pretty much opening in the UK, the United States. I voted before I left. I walked, kind of several weeks ago, my postal vote, put it in the drop box before I thought anybody was likely to set them on fire, because there's all these kinds of worrying about, whether people might try to sabotage, vote in the moment. Early voting has been remarkable, and something like 75 million people have voted early because they're so anxious about this. Everybody knows that things have got to change, and I think that that's very appropriate, sitting here in the cathedral where one of the themes of the early Christian church was about renewal, about shedding and bringing light out of the seeming darkness. That's kind of really the message of this venerable institution. It's also the message of education, and going back to Durham University and to all of the students that we have here, this is a kind of promise of something new. We'd be letting people down if we didn't start to think about doing things differently. And I think there'll be a real push. There's been, let's just say, some really sobering lessons from this political campaign. I'm part of a whole set of groups, not just at Brookings, but elsewhere, people who are really thinking about the future of American democracy. People are kind of thinking about that here as well, because the political parties don't speak to everybody. That people are trying to think about, what do you do in your communities? What do you do in kind of society at large to bring change? How can we find opportunity, new opportunities to do something different? And of course, we've got some existential threats. Climate change, even if there might be some debate still, in kind of some circles about what's driving it, we can see from these devastating floods in places like Valencia that the kind of 100-year occurrences that people, thought were, literally 100 years they were rare, have become more frequent. Something has shifted for sure, and we're going to have to figure out how we deal with that. Pandemics. I'm always nervously reading in the US press about bird flu, which, kind of keeps spreading around farms in the United States. The United States gave us the 1918 flu pandemic. COVID started, in China, somewhere around Wuhan. But basically the last great, kind of bird flu epidemic started in poultry farms in Kansas in 1918. And there's bird flu from, the wild spreading into poultry flocks, into cattle, and it's been found recently in a pig in a farm because of the proximity with animals. Here we go again, I keep thinking. And if society isn't pulling together, then here we go again in a very negative way if we don't basically get our act together. So this is a time to be serious about renewal and thinking about things in different ways.
Well, you've given us a huge encouragement to do just that, Fiona. We are really grateful. We reached the end of our time together. It's been not only illuminating stimulating, challenging to hear some of the messages, but also that message of hope, of renewal, has been really important for us to hear. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that we go into the coverage of the US election tonight much better informed. The polls close at 11 p.m. It may be some time before an announcement is made in terms of results. Here at Durham Cathedral, we're going to be praying for the United States, its people, and its candidates in this election, whoever emerges as president, and for a God who holds that future in God's hands, and for a future marked by peace. But for today, I wonder if we might express our gratitude to Fiona for all that she's given us, for the wisdom she's offered, for the insight she's brought us, and for her own story that is a huge encouragement in ourselves. Can we express our thanks?
Thank you.
Three notices from me before we close, just three things. First of all, do please take an opportunity before you go today to view the exhibition of the miners' banners in either aisle. The exhibition closes later this week. Secondly, if you're in Durham for the rest of today, do join us for Evensong, when we'll be praying for our world as ever in the context of worship and music. And thirdly, the final event in the autumn programme of Durham Cathedral Institute will be held in the Chapter House this Thursday, and the title, as Fiona alluded to, is Mining Global Heritage, Who Makes Us Who We Are. And the keynote speaker will be Ross Forbes, who is the CEO of Red Hills, and you're going to be there as part of the panel. I'll look forward to being there. To book a free ticket, follow the link on our website. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. We're particularly thrilled that our sixth form students have been with us. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for the questions that you've asked. Have a safe journey home, and God bless.